Seated. We have started a series together, and so for the foreseeable future, as I teach our Sunday school class, I'm just going to teach you some things as the Lord has given things to me. I've noticed this morning I have a defective. Could you find me one that doesn't fall apart? That'd be great. I noticed this morning that the direction that our Sunday school class is going to go is going to be in concert with the morning service. I didn't design that, but the Lord did. So I'm going to teach you this morning on how to have a good fight. Yeah? How many married couples do we have in here, right? And you're like, I should have brought my husband to church today. Thank you, Luke, for that. So I want you to take Proverbs 25 in your Bible is where we're going to start. We'll look at a number of scriptures together today. The class that we're going to be going through here for the rest of this year, undoubtedly, unless the Lord changes direction, is just one that we're calling Foundations. And this is just a framework for biblical living. How do we live biblically? How do we live right? And that's the point. And so in all of these, as I had been praying through what to teach over this period of time, I was just putting things down that the Lord gave to me in the order that he gave to me. And so this was just happened to be the second thing on the list, and I think it will be helpful for all of us. All right, so we're going to look at Proverbs 25. There's so much in Proverbs that would help us in marriage, but I want you to look at verse 28 just to start off with. The Bible says, "He that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that's broken down and without walls." That is just going to be a text for the whole morning. You know what? That's just a great text for life right there. But certainly as we think about marriage, this could be in any relationship, but really this is just going to apply to marriage. So I know some of you aren't married yet. Some of you are well on your way. And there's things in relationships that this is just going to be healthy in any relationship, but particularly in a marriage relationship. I don't know if you remember this. Some of you were here years ago. I was thinking about it this morning. 20 years ago, there was a guy that stood here, and he had been invited to preach here from another country. And I remember very clearly that he stood and he said, and at that time he and his wife had been married for, I suppose, probably 20 years or something. I remember he stood and he said that my wife and I have never had a fight. And I was sitting right in here somewhere and I was watching him say that, and I thought that to myself. I mean, God forgive me for it. I thought, you are lying. How in the world could you be married for 20 years and not have a fight, okay? Unless she's a deaf mute, you're going to have conflict in your marriage, right? So there's no way I'm going to ask this question of everybody, but surely those of you that are married here have had a fight with your spouse. We have some more newly married couples in here. And I know maybe you've married, a year or less, but surely you've already had some sort of conflict in your relationship. It's just going to happen. And so the issue is not, are we having conflict or will we have conflict? But the issue is, how do we manage the conflict that will inevitably come in a relationship? We have different people with different personalities. I don't know that I've ever yet come across a couple that married that were identical in their personality. They didn't see things the same way. She likes this kind of food and he likes that kind of food. Usually she's the talker and he's the quiet one, but there's some relationships it's just the opposite, right? He's the talker and she's the quiet one. You have opposites, and it's true that opposites attract. And so when you have opposites that are together in this relationship, even though there's love in that relationship, there can always be the potential for conflict. And you can't divorce your spirituality from the fact that you're living that out in a human body that still has a sinful nature. Those things have to coexist. But you have to know how to manage the human side of you, the carnal nature that's still on the inside of you. That's why this verse in Proverbs is so important. You got to have a rule over your spirit. So let me just say some things about marriage. We'll talk about this. So as I'm going to say some introductory remarks here, turn to Ephesians chapter number 4, if you will. Did you know that marriage is about glorifying God, not just about your personal happiness? Did you know that? Marriage, in the context of two believers in Christ, is about glorifying God. It's not just about the fact that you want to be happy. Now, I would hope, with husbands and wives that are here today, I would hope that you're in a relationship with your spouse and you're actually happy in that relationship. Because happiness is certainly a wonderful byproduct of a godly relationship. But ultimately, as a child of God, your marriage is about glorifying God first, right? Therefore, whatsoever you do, whether you eat or drink, right? Whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. So what we should think about is, okay, I want my marriage to glorify God, not just do this so that I can be happy. So the things that are going to sustain your marriage as a Christian are going to be a reliance on the Bible first and foremost. That's the thing that's going to sustain your marriage. And then you just need to have the grace of God in your marriage to sustain you. And, we live in a broken society. We live in, statistically speaking, there's just this massively high divorce rate here in Australia. And it's not just here in Australia. Around the world, there's this ridiculously high divorce rate because people view marriage today as very much we'll just try it out. There is no long-term, contract we're going to sign, commitment that we really have to one another. We'll sign a prenup, or we may not sign a prenup, but we'll have that in our mind that's just kind of the way marriage is going to be. So we have a world that's so far removed from the biblical principles of marriage. But I'm going to give you some thoughts, and then we'll look at a bunch of Bible as we go through this. So the first thing I want you to look at in Ephesians chapter 4 is this. When we think about marriage, we have two sinners in the same room. All right? Two sinners in the same room. So in Ephesians 4, Paul says this, and this is just speaking in generalities about relationships between believers. But I'm going to apply this to relationships between a husband and wife. Verse number 31 of Ephesians chapter 4. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice, and be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. Let me ask you this. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions today, and I don't want you to answer. Are you kind in your marriage? Husbands and wives, are you kind? You're not going to have a deep level of intimacy, not physical, but emotional intimacy in your marriage if you're not kind to each other. You have to be kind. What we have in a marriage is we have two sinners that occupy the same space. And what happens when sinners say, I do? And how do we deal with that as sinful people? Both of you are sinners in your marriage. And both of you were in need of redemption by the Lord Jesus Christ. That's just the fact of a marriage. And so what you have is you have two sinners that are trying to live in holiness and occupy the same space. And the reality is in your personal life as a Christian, sometimes you can't occupy the space with you. You're trying to occupy the space as a believer, and you're fighting your own self. You've got this old nature, and you're in conflict with that. And then another person enters into that relationship, and you got two sinners that are in living under the same roof. And sin is the underlying cause of conflict in your relationship. Now, sometimes you will have conflict that just arises out of preferences or personalities. There's really no sin involved. But quite often conflict, serious conflict in a relationship is the result of sin, not just external circumstances. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with it? Quite often in a marriage relationship, what you have is a person's unwillingness to accept or admit that their own sinful heart was the cause of the disruption in the marriage. Have you ever had that where something has happened that was actually just ridiculous? And you responded wrongly to something that was just really stupid. I wasn't even if there ever a time where it's worth a fight, this one was not worth a fight. But something happened and you responded wrongly to this. And in the very moment you responded wrongly, you were saying to yourself, this is ridiculous that I'm responding this way or thinking this way or acting this way. But then pride welled up on the inside of you and you did not want to back down and you kept going, and the Spirit of God was telling you in that very moment, you're being stupid, but you didn't listen, right? And then what was a molehill turned into a mountain. And quite often in times of conflict in your marriage, what you have here is you have a person's pride in their own sinful heart, And they're not willing to just simply admit the fact that it was me being childish. And for me, in my life, any times where I've had conflict where I knew that I was the one that instigated the conflict or caused it in my marriage, the thing that's always been my biggest stumbling block is the fact that I knew that I was being childish. I was acting like a teenager, and then I was unwilling to admit that, and it just made the conflict greater because I was acting like a little kid, and I was embarrassed and ashamed of myself, but then I didn't want to own up to her that I was acting like a little kid, and so I just got my back up and created even a bigger problem. Well, all that's just pride. All that in our life is just pride. And so it disrupts the unity of our marriage. What's the issue? The issue is you have two sinners that are occupying the same room. So this recognition of my personal sin, what it does is it shifts the blame from my spouse to me now having to take responsibility for myself. So I've got to stop in the moment and just go, okay, hang on a minute. I know we have a disagreement. There's a potential for this to escalate into something bigger, but I'm just going to realize I'm a sinner in my nature, and I'm going to take responsibility for what's happening here. I'm not going to shift it to her, because I found it's really easy in my relationship that I can just shift the blame to my wife because it absolves me of any sort of personal responsibility. I can just blame her for it, when the reality is I need to dare to look on the inside and see what's going on. So what I'm saying to you is when you're faced with conflict in your marriage, don't run from it, resolve it. Resolve it. And you're only going to resolve it if you realize that you're a sinner occupying space with another sinner. Okay? The example is this, that if you walk into the auditorium and you see some rubbish laying on the floor, a wrapper that somebody left last Sunday, and you observe it and then you just walk by it, and then you show up next Sunday, that piece of rubbish is still going to be there, and most probably there's going to be something else. And then there's going to be something else and something else. And before long, what you know is that the entire carpet is filled with garbage that nobody picked up, and it just piles up and just creates a huge mess. And that's exactly what happens in your marriage. If you just walk by a problem, you walk by a little conflict, and you don't pick it up and deal with it one by one, then what happens is you have a whole life of unresolved problems that you can't seem to get over because you never just picked up the one piece of rubbish in your marriage, the one thing, the one source of conflict that was causing all of the problems. So deal with your issues one thing at a time, and when you do it, deal with it in humility, recognizing that you're a sinner just like your spouse is a sinner, and you have to deal with it that way. Okay, first of all, we got to realize there's two sinners that are sharing the same space. Look with me at Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. Of course, this is going to be the Lord speaking to us here and giving us a principle that's going to be helpful toward the end of this chapter. The statement I'm going to make here, the first one was that you have two sinners in the same room. Okay, the statement out of Luke chapter 6 is this: it's half blind and all dumb. Okay, now let's read this. Luke chapter 6. Jesus said this in verse number 41. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye? Hey, do you know where we're going with this? Okay. Why beholdest thou the mote that's in thy brother's eye, but perceivest not the beam that's in thine own eye? Either how canst thou say to thy brother, brother, let me pull out the mote that's in thine eye, when thou thyself beholdest not the beam that's in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, cast out first the beam out of thine own eye, and then thou shalt see clearly to pull out the mote that's in thy brother's eye. Oh, we can all see where this is going in marriage. That's why I said you're half blind and all dumb when we talk about conflict. You know, a critical spirit that you have toward the weakness of your spouse, it only shows your inability to see your own weakness. It's very easy to observe the weakness in other people around us. We can come to church and we can see failures in people that are kind of in our circle. We have a friend circle or we have a church family circle. It's very easy to identify failures in other people's lives. All you have to do is be around them for a little while. And in a church setting, we're not really around each other a lot, are we? A little bit on Sunday, a little bit on Wednesday, but beyond that, we don't see each other a great deal probably during the week. But, you know, when you're living with somebody and you're sharing your whole life with that person, you're around them all the time. It's not hard to see their weaknesses. We all have failures. We all have inconsistencies in our life. And so for us to observe the weaknesses in somebody else that we're married to and to develop a critical spirit about their weaknesses, all that shows is a failure to see ourselves. And that's the very issue that Jesus was dealing with here. He says, you're looking at the failure in somebody else, and you're wanting to pull this little sliver out of their eye, and you don't realize you've got a great big pole sticking out of your own eye. You can't even see you. How can you see them if you don't see you? But we can develop that critical spirit toward our spouse. Now, again, a question I don't want you to answer is, are you critical of your husband or are you critical of your wife? Surely they all have something in their life that's worthy of criticism. Siri's going to give us the remedy. We all have something that's worthy of criticism, don't we? There's not a just man upon the earth that doeth good and sinneth not. I mean, we're looking at a bunch of sinners here. We all have things in our life that are inconsistent. We all have standards that we've set for ourselves that we also break for ourselves. So there's none of us that are perfect in any way. So why is it that we would develop a critical spirit toward the person that we love, the person that we committed our life to? We entered into a covenant of marriage with that person before God in the sight of all these people around us. We've gone into that relationship with them, and then we would get angry at them or develop a criticism toward them about some weakness in their life when we fail to see the weakness in our own life. Why would we do that? We're half blind and we're all dumb. It's a dumb thing to do. That's what Jesus is bringing out in the passage here. So the weaknesses that we see in our spouse, can I help you to understand? They're not failures. There may be weaknesses that are observed in other people, your spouse, but it doesn't mean that it's a failure. It just maybe means that there's a little bit of a weakness. All right, you know that God makes a husband and a wife to be together, and when we look at the way God defined this for us in Genesis chapter 2, then what we find that there's a deficiency in a man that a woman completes. She's not better than him, but she's different than him. And so she has strengths to his weaknesses. And let me just flip that around. He has strengths to her weaknesses. And when you marry right, you marry to your weaknesses. You find the person and you're naturally drawn to the person that completes the weakness that you have in your life. That makes a wonderful marriage. You shouldn't be threatened by the fact that he or she has a strength that you don't have. You should embrace that fact as this is something God has designed for me that helps complete me, and it makes us as a husband and wife have the capacity to fulfill a meaningful relationship to the glory of God. Why? Because we're using the strengths and weaknesses that we both possess to be one complete person in the sight of God. But we don't view the weakness of our spouse as a failure of our spouse. Why would we do that? Why would we come across to that person knowing that they have a weakness? Why would we act as a spouse? Why would we act toward our husband or toward our wife that this is a weakness and therefore it's a failure? If you perceive something in your husband or you perceive something in your wife that you consider to be a failure, here's the remedy for you. Number one, pray about it. You can't force change into your spouse. And God forbid that you would try to force change into your spouse. When you got married all those years ago, for some of you that have been married a while, you married the person that existed at the time you went to the altar, not the person you were going to kind of craft them to be 10 years down the road. When you say I do, you're saying I do to the you that's here, not to the person I'm going to try to develop you into later on. I'm saying I do to you, which therefore means that regardless of whether there's ever a change in that man or ever a change in that woman from this day forward, I fully accept you and love you for who you are today, warts and all. All of your weaknesses and any inconsistencies that I may see in our marriage later on that are exhibited in your life, I love you in spite of those things. I don't perceive those as failures in your life. Did you marry that person for that reason or not? Or did you marry them because you're going to craft them into some image you have of the perfect man or the perfect woman? Your marriage is doomed to failure if that's how you've started it out. So if you see something in your spouse that you think, oh, maybe this is a weakness in their life, you're not going to force that change into their life. Only God can change the heart, correct? So what do? We pray about it. If you see something in your husband or something in your wife that you perceive to be a weakness, pray about that thing. And then here's what you should do, lovingly, fill that gap. If you see a weakness in their life, you go ahead and try to fill that gap. That's the purpose of a godly marriage. You're strengthening a weakness in your spouse. Don't hold it against them. And listen, don't hammer them over the head. That's the whole purpose of which Jesus is saying here. Don't you understand? He used the word hypocrite. You've got a mask on. You're hiding behind your mask of perfection. But the reality is you pull that mask off and you're as much a failure as your perception of your spouse. So don't be a hypocrite. Don't hide behind a mask of perfection. That's what an actor was. That's what the word is, a hypocrite. So what balances out the marriage is that you have a strength where your spouse has a weakness. I don't call him a partner. That's such a generic Australian term. A husband or a wife. A husband or a wife. And so your husband or your wife, all right, if you have a gap and that other person has a strength in that, that's what balances your marriage out. It creates a greater unity of bond and of love. And here's why. Because your husband or your wife knows that they have a weakness in that area. It's kind of coded into their DNA. They know they're not great at this thing, and they know that you're actually better at this thing than them, but they also know that you don't hammer them over the head because of their failure. And it creates a greater love and trust between the two of you. Because you're not saying, hey, let me just tell you about all this big problem you have in your life. You just pray about it. You step in to help fill that need. It develops a greater love. Now, we haven't even got to the fight yet. We'll get to the fight. But it's just a dumb thing to do to look at the failures, your perception of their failures, without looking at yourself first. And that's the point Jesus was making here. So don't look at the problems that they have without first looking at yourself. You take care of you, and then you'll see clearly to take care of them. But the reality is, if you and I just take care of us, and our eyes are opened with no beam in our eye, we're going to look at our husband or we're going to look at our wife, and we're going to say, actually, there's nothing wrong with you. The issue was me all along. The critical spirit that I had. All right, so let's talk about how to fight. How to fight. You know, we could roll the mats out right here, roll your sleeves up, let's go at it. Toe to toe, husband and wife. How do we fight in marriage? All right, I'm going to go back to the guy that said this thing in our church all those years ago. That's ridiculous. Don't ever say that you've been married for any period of time and you never had a fight. Now, there's differing degrees of fights. Okay, now throwing dishes, that's an entirely different kind of fight, all right? How many of you have ever thrown dishes in your marriage? Don't raise your hand. So there's different levels of fighting, all right? So let's talk about how to fight as a husband and a wife. And as humorous as it is, and there could be a lot of stories in here. I'd love to hear some stories, just not in church, okay? Let's talk about the how-tos. So you might write this down because you're human and you need this, all right? So the first one is this: keep your pride in subjection. How to have a good fight is, number one, keep your pride in subjection. So let me read you what Solomon said in Proverbs 13. Only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. So only by pride cometh contention. So what you need to understand is that in marriage, when you have conflict that develops into a fight, what's the root cause of all this? Pride is there. It's either yours, or it's his or hers, or it's both of you. But pride is there, which causes the contention. So how do we deal with that? How do we keep our pride in subjection? It goes back to the original verse that we started off. You've got to learn how to rule your spirit. You've got to control yourself. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 7, if you'll turn over there, I just want you to see a couple of verses. We'll look at Ecclesiastes 7, and we'll look at Proverbs chapter number 16. This is something that I would just challenge you, whether you are quick to anger or not. I would just challenge you to read this verse and memorize it. Burn it into your heart, all right? Ecclesiastes 7 and verse number 9, Solomon said this: be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. I will confess to you, I think I've confessed it before, so it's easier the second time. I'm quick to get angry. I always have been. It's not an excuse and it's not a justification for anything. It's just the reality of who I am. And I know that it tends toward foolishness in my life. I know that it creates a greater level of conflict in my marriage if I let it, because I'm too quick to be angry. So what does God say? Don't be hasty in your spirit to be angry, because anger rests on the inside of a fool. You have to learn how to control your spirit. We live in a society today that shifts the blame everywhere except for me. So it's my circumstances that cause this. Oh, it's my family that caused this. It's my school. It's my job. It was my upbringing. It's this big reversal that happened to me. It's society. It's the government. And we have all these things that shift the blame from me. So I'm justified in my own mind. I'm justified in getting mad about everything. I'm quick to get angry, and I can justify it anyway because I'm looking out here and saying it's everybody else's fault except for mine. Solomon says, no, don't be quick to be angry. You're just showing yourself to be a fool. Look at Proverbs chapter 16. I've asked you to look there as well. Here's another great verse, verse number 32. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. To rule your spirit is to have control over, to exercise authority over. And God says, you exercise authority over you. Control you, is what he's saying. Rule yourself. A big part of marriage, and listen to me, living in the big people's world is learning for you to control your emotions instead of emotions controlling you. We all have emotions, and some of us have a greater flare-up more quickly of our emotions than other people. But this is the big people's world. This is called the adult world. And you and I both know that you can get married, put the ring on, and you could be in your 40s and in your 50s and in your 60s and still act like a child emotionally. You have to learn, we have to learn as Christians to rule our emotions, to control our emotions. And it's so important that we understand that. What happens when you have an emotional rise that you don't control? Here's what happens. It always results in something coming out of your mouth. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, Solomon said. And you can kill your marriage by what you say. And you'll say it because you just had a fit of rage. You got angry about the fact that she wanted chicken and you wanted a steak, and this escalated into something absolutely ridiculous, and you said something you could never take back. And you've killed the trust, and you've killed the love, and you've killed the intimacy in your marriage, because death is in the power of the tongue. And you didn't control your emotions, and you flew off the handle in a rage about something that was ridiculous. And you've damaged your marriage. They that love it, he said, shall eat the fruit of it. So if death and life are both within the power of my tongue, whatever I love, I'll eat the fruit of it. So if life is in the power of my tongue, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give life through what I say to my spouse. I'm going to speak words of love, and I'm going to speak words of affirmation, and I'm going to speak respectfully, and I'm going to speak in honor. And what I'm going to receive is the fruit of that in my marriage, which is sweet and wonderful. But the opposite of that is also true. And if I will not control my tongue, and I will not control my temper, and I will not control my words, my pride has welled up, and it destroys the love in your marriage. So we're talking about keeping your pride into subjection. And you have to recognize the need for personal humility in the moment. This is a tough one. Because in the moment, we feel justified in feeling the way that we feel. I'm frustrated, I'm angry, whatever the emotion is, and I feel completely justified in that moment in feeling that way toward her or toward him. And I feel justified in doing that, but we have to recognize I need to have some real humility in this very moment, because we all know this in a marriage, conflict can very quickly turn into anger. A small little conflict can very quickly turn into something that's out of control. And often that anger stems from a deep personal shame at what we did. We get angry, like I said before, because we know that we're actually at fault for being stupid in our marriage, acting unwisely, saying something, doing something that we shouldn't have done. And there's a deep personal shame that comes from that. So we don't admit our failure. We don't admit that we had a lack of wisdom in this area. Speaking with somebody recently about an issue in their life, in their marriage, and they were talking about the fact that they'd made a really unwise financial decision. There was no sin necessarily in it. It was just they did something, and it was just a really unwise thing to do. And then they had to go face up to their wife and talk about that thing. I did that. I don't know if you remember, those of you, I don't know if this was the whole church or maybe it was just our men's meeting with Brother Welder a few weeks back. But he was talking about this matter in his own marriage. And years ago when God called him to preach and he was the president of the bank, they'd had a large amount of savings. Did he say this to the whole church? Had a large amount of savings, and he knew that when they were going to go off into the ministry, they had this money that they could fall back on. But, he heard about a need, and so he just emptied the savings account and gave toward this need, and he didn't tell his wife. And then when God called him to preach and they're about ready to walk away from a career and step off into their training, she's thinking, okay, well, at least we have some savings that we can live on as we're going through college. And when she got the bank statement, it showed a zero balance. Her face was just as white as a sheet. What happened? And he's like, oops, I didn't tell my wife. Sometimes, we have this really deep shame in the fact that we did something, and, we have to own up to it. And we have to have the humility to own up to it and keep our pride in check so it doesn't result in anger. If you get angry, it's not going to solve the problem. Have you noticed that in your life? No matter how justified or righteous you think your anger is in your marriage, it's not going to solve the problem. It's only going to make the problem worse. So you have to learn to keep your pride into subjection. All right, look at Romans chapter 14. Here's another principle of dealing with this in your marriage. Romans chapter 14. All right, let's just look at one verse here, verse number 19. Let us therefore follow after the things which make for peace, and the things wherewith one may edify another. Okay, number one, you got to keep your pride in subjection. Number two, you have to determine to be a peacemaker. I would ask you this as a husband or as a wife, are you a peacemaker? Do you follow after the things which make for peace? Now, here's a caution. Don't be a peace faker. There's a lot of these in marriage. These are the apologists and chiefs. These are the ones who apologize for everything in the marriage just to try to keep the peace. I may not even be at fault in this thing, but I'm going to apologize anyway just so I can keep the peace in our marriage, just so I can get him to calm down, just so I can get her to calm down, just so that we finally have some sort of, quote, stability in our marriage. We just want to make it go away. You are a peace faker. And I'll tell you what that does. What that does is build resentment in your heart toward your spouse. Over time, you build a great degree of resentment in your heart toward your spouse because you're apologizing for something that they did over and over and over just to keep the peace when you know that they're the one that should be coming to you and apologizing for what they've done. It creates resentment in your marriage. Don't be a peace faker. There's always going to be compromise in marriage. We all know that. There's going to be a certain degree of compromise in your marriage, but you don't compromise in your marriage just to appease your spouse. Never do that. We can compromise in the little things. There's a lot of things in marriage that just don't matter. What color do you want the curtains? It doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter. What do you want for dinner? Anything but zucchini. Aside from that, it doesn't matter. There's some things that you do in your marriage that compromise, but don't ever fake peace just to appease your husband or just to appease your wife. You're actually creating a great problem underneath the surface. And listen to me, it will erupt one day. So don't be a peace faker. Don't be a peace breaker. This is the one who just blows the fuse all the time. Quick, boom, gonna blow my stack. Okay, don't be that. Be a peacemaker. Embrace the opportunity to solve this thing biblically. What did Paul say in this verse? Let us therefore follow after the things which make for peace, and the things wherewith one may edify another. Guys, this wasn't just given in the context of do this in church. Start this in your home. Follow after the things that make for peace. Live at peace with one another. There should be no reason in a marriage that we cannot live in peace together. Not appeasement, but peace. So we learn to keep our pride in subjection, but we learn, secondly, that we should determine to be a peacemaker. Are you a peacemaker in your marriage? Will you determine, I'm going to make the peace here? Number 3, look at James chapter 1. You might know where we're going with this one. Keep a guard over your tongue. Keep a guard over your tongue. I gave reference to this a minute ago. I'm going to go back to it just for a moment. James 1, verse number 19. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. You can't take back words. You know the little kids saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, right? That's such a lie. You'd probably rather have a broken bone than to have to deal for 15 years with what your husband said about you or what your wife said to you. You'd rather have a cast on your leg than to have that thing in your heart you can never get rid of. A bone heals and the heart doesn't. The heart never forgets. You can't take it back. So listen, don't say it. Keep a guard over your tongue. I think that's why the Lord says here, be swift to hear and slow to speak. You've heard the expression, you have, 2 ears and 1 mouth. There's probably a reason for that. And you can undo years of trust and stability in your marriage with an ungoverned tongue. So are you quick with your tongue? Usually in a marriage, one person is quick. Are you quick with your tongue? Take the admonition from the Lord. Be slow to speak. If you're in James 1, look over to chapter 3. He deals with the tongue a whole lot here, but would you notice in verse number 5, just the one verse, he says this, even so, James 3 and verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. How much can words inflame a situation? Because we're too quick to speak. Keep a guard on your tongue. If you want to have a good fight, just keep your mouth shut. You're going to have conflict and fights in your marriage from time to time. I dare say that they should grow less as your marriage increases. If you're fighting more in your later years than you were in your earlier years, you need some help. There's a problem. You should fight less, okay? But when you have to have a fight, keep control of your tongue. Guard it. Guard it. Because the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. You can't do right and be right when you're angry at your spouse. Control your tongue. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter number 8. Here's one that I have a hard time with. Actually, I probably have said that about each one of these, so you know how to pray for me. Ecclesiastes chapter number 8, if you will. This is a verse that I have used in my own life and in the ministry many times over the years. No doubt that you have done the same. But here's the principle. The principle is this: learn to let some things go. Learn to let some things go. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and drop down to verse number 9. All this have I seen and applied my heart unto every work that's done under the sun. Here it is. There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. To rule is to have your way. To rule is to exercise dominion or authority. You can have your way, but what's it going to cost you to have your way? Hey, you can have the last word, but what's it going to cost your marriage for you to have the last word? You can say the thing that's just right on your lips and it's about to just burst forth in all this glorious eloquence that's going to strip the trust and love out of your relationship, but what's it going to cost you to have your way? You need to learn to let some things go. Just let some things go. The discretion of a man, Solomon said, deferreth his anger. It's his glory to pass over a transgression. Okay, now listen, in the context of marriage, let's say your husband has transgressed, stepped over a line. That's what the word means. They've stepped over a line with you, and they've done something, he said something, or he's done something to you, and you are justified in saying something back. God said, you know what? If you have discretion, your anger will be deferred, and you'll just pass over the transgression. That's what charity does. Charity in the New Testament context is a demonstrated love that we have one toward another, and it overlooks the faults because love is there. It's actually your glory, your brightness. It's to your benefit to just pass over the transgression. The reality is, if you pass over that transgression that your husband has done toward you, there's going to be times where you're going to transgress against him, and you would appreciate it if he would just pass over that transgression for you. You have to learn to let some things go. Not everything's worth a fight. Not everything's worth an argument. Not everything really matters enough that you have to have some sort of a conflict in your relationship. There's only going to be very few things in your life that maybe could be any sort of real conflict that you have to negotiate. But so much of marriage and the things of marriage are just preferential, and they're small little things that in the whole context of your life in marriage don't really matter that much. It's not worth the fight. I'm not just saying just to appease. I'm just saying it doesn't matter enough to have conflict about it. Now, there will be things that matter that way, but a lot of things won't. So what do? We've just got to learn, okay, I'm not going to have my way. Some things just don't really matter. It's not worth the cost of an argument and a fight because ultimately it doesn't really matter. I'll just let it go. Be quick to forgive. We go back to Ephesians 4, verse 32. Be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another. Why? Well, because God, for Christ's sake, forgave you. So forgive them. If you want to have a good fight, then just learn to let some things go. Or if you have a little bit of conflict and you're just trying to pass over that transgression, just resolve that whole thing quickly. We're just going to fix all of this. We're not going to let it carry on. Man, some things can just carry on. There should never be a time where you're sleeping on the couch. That should never happen in your marriage. I mean, unless he just snores like a logging truck, there should be no time that you're sleeping in another room. You guys should live together, dwell together, sleep together, love together. That's the way God designed your marriage. But if you're always in conflict and always fighting, and he's on the couch and you're mad at him and you're mad at her, I keep blaming the wife for all this, can you tell? If that's happening in the marriage, there is a problem that needs to be fixed because that's not how God designed your marriage to be. So if you are transgressed against, and they've done something or said something, and you are just in responding to this, God just says, have a little discretion to defer that anger. It's actually to your glory. Just pass over. Just let it go. Don't hold your spouse to this standard of perfection that you can't even achieve in your own life. They are not perfect people. They are sinners that need the grace of God to deal with their own sin and then learn how to deal with you. So afford them the same courtesy that you afford yourself in your marriage. Cease from anger, David said, and forsake wrath. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil, to do wrong. Just don't. Cease. Stop. Just let it go. So how do we deal with conflict, and how do we fight right? Keep your pride in subjection. Determined to be a peacemaker. Keep a guard over your tongue. Learn to let some things go. So let me just give you a couple of concluding thoughts here, and then you can go out and argue with your spouse over morning tea, okay? Conflict is natural when you have two people that are sharing their life together, okay? But fighting is not natural. Conflict can come because you have differing opinions and perspectives that are now confronted with one another, but that doesn't have to end in a fight every time. Doesn't have to. So when you find yourself being confronted by a conflict in your marriage, let me give you some practical thoughts and we'll be done. Number one, immediately in that moment, just ask the Lord to give you wisdom in understanding how to resolve the conflict. Don't allow your passion and your emotion to flare up. Just in that very moment, just ask the Lord, okay, Lord, give me wisdom to deal with this. Okay, number 2, be patient and hear the other person out. So much of conflict comes because we are not communicating and we're not listening. So be patient, hear the other person out. Don't just listen to the words, hear the heart of the person. Hear the heart. Have you ever felt that way? It's like, I know you're listening to what's coming out of my mouth, but you're not hearing me. Okay? So stop just listening to words. Hear the heart of your husband or the heart of your wife. Number 3, talk. Talk. This is easier for one of you than it is for the other. One of you is a talker, and one of you is a leave me alone, I need to process. But you have to talk. So you both have to openly and freely communicate. And listen, do it with courtesy and honesty with each other. Just be honest. Listen, you're married. Be honest with each other. Next, be quick to apologize if you have offended your husband or you've offended your wife. Just admit if you were wrong. And you may have to say this, I was wrong, I'm sorry, it was the dumbest thing ever. But I was wrong. Be quick to forgive if the other person has offended you. So if you have given offense, be quick to apologize. If they have offended you, be quick to forgive. Be quick to forgive. Don't hold a grudge, for crying out loud. You ever heard that expression, life's too short? Don't hold a grudge. Forgive. And then last, once the forgiveness has either been offered or the forgiveness has been accepted, keep it in the past. We don't resurrect past hurts and failures so that we can club it over the head of our husband or club it over the head of our wife with our future arguments. Leave it in the past. How oft shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? And God isn't telling you to keep a ledger of 490 times. Just keep forgiving. Let it lie in the past, okay? Now, if you'll do that, you'll actually have a good fight. And so I'd love to hear some testimonies next week of how your week went, okay? But hopefully it's practical and helpful. And I want to encourage you, the answers to the issues that you and I may face in our marriage, they're found in the Bible. The issue is not with the Bible. The issue is with us practicing and living out the truths that are found there. And I just want to encourage you to do that, all right?